Hey everyone, thanks so much for coming today. My name's Amanda Legge, and I'm the creative technology lead at Capital One. So my team does like VR projects, AR projects, capacitive ink technology, if any of you guys have heard of that. Basically anything like crazy that designers and engineers put together that you can think of to solve problems. So before I was on the creative tech team though, I was a dedicated mobile designer. So I designed mostly for Android and iOS, which is why I'm here today. And what I want to share with you guys today is my favorite UI animation tool, which is called Principle. So just to get a pulse check on the audience here, how many of you guys have used Principle before? OK, less than half. So I'm going to go into over a couple more advanced concepts, but I think it will still be helpful to just see the breadth of the tool. But I'll try to do a quick summary of the basics too when we jump in. Principle is a tool that you can download online. The website is principleformac.com. So that is the one unfortunate thing about it, is that it only works for Macs. So yeah, it's like, I think most designers I know have Macs, so it's kind of OK, but that is a bummer. But the nice thing about it is that it has a really small learning curve. So as soon as you open it, you can get up and running really, really fast. The interface is very similar to Sketch, which is another industry standard static UI design tool. And I think the price point is pretty reasonable. It's $129 for a full year of updates. But even if you don't update, you still have access to that version of Principle forever. So I think it's a lot better than the monthly subscription model. It seems more fair to me. And the one last thing is that there's a 14-day free trial, but it's actually a free trial, like a 14-day free trial. So if I open it today during the conference and then not for 2 weeks, that second time that I open it will be like day number 2. So that's really nice. Like you don't have to just like use it in just those first 2 weeks. So anyway, that's a little bit of background about Principle. So the structure of this talk. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull a couple concepts from the material design guidelines, and then I'm going to show a real-world example of it. And then I'm actually going to open up Principle and recreate that real-world example live for you guys, so you can see how versatile this tool is. And I'm going to try to do that with 3 different examples. So I'm going to be moving pretty quickly, but just to give you guys a breadth of what this tool can do. So let's get started. So the first concept I want to talk about is easing. And I think this is a pretty standard concept that probably most of you guys are familiar with. Basically, this purple dot right here is showing easing, so it slowly speeds up and then slows down at the end, whereas this pink dot right here is just moving at the same speed. So easing is basically pulling from the natural laws of physics. It's pretty standard, and it makes transitions not look stiff and mechanical like that pink dot on the right. So I think a good example of this is just the classic loading animation. So right here, you can see there's the blue line, and it kind of slowly starts spinning around, and then whips around, and then slows down again at the top. So just a pretty standard easing, and you can also see it scales there, like the tail stretches as it goes around. So this is going to be the first example I'm going to do right now. So I'm just going to open up Principle here. And I have my artboard here set to width. Keyboard strokes, thanks, Dan. Have this set to width of 200 and a height of 200, just so you guys can see it. But if you guys are familiar with Sketch, it's very similar layout. So here is where you'll see the different layers in your file. This is where you have access to the properties, and here are some alignment tools. And then over here is where you have your previewer. So this is where we'll actually be able to click and see the different animations. So what I'm going to do is, so I could add a rectangle here in the upper left, but I can also tap R, and that's the shortcut to creating a rectangle. So I'm just going to scale this up and center it. And I'm going to lock the constraints here so that it's actually a square. And I'm just going to use a round 150 number here. So I'm going to add a stroke here of 15. And then I'm actually going to set the fill of this to 0. And then I'm going to increase this radius up a lot, just so that we have that circular shape here. And I'll change the stroke color to a lighter gray. So now we have the basics of the spinner. And then I'm going to add another rectangle, which will be the line going around. So I'll just change the color first. So I have this like nice blue. And I'm going to also bump the radius up here. And I'm going to constrain this so that it's a circle and just use around 50 by 50 here. So now we have that. And what I'm going to do is group these two layers together right here and just label this loading animation. And I'm going to check clip sublayers. And this works kind of like masking in Photoshop or Sketch, if any of you guys are familiar with that. And what this does is, you'll see when I grab the folder outline of this, it's masking the whole, all the layers inside of it. So I'm just going to make sure that this mask is also at 150, so it matches the size of our circle here. And then I'm going to change the radius of the sublayer itself. So right now it's a square, but I'm going to change this, just bump it up a lot so that it's actually rounded. And so now you can see it's matching the shape of it, so it's cutting it off. And then the last thing we're going to do for setup before we get into the actual animation stuff is cover this up with a white layer covering the other side. So instead of a mask, I'm just going to cover it right here. So I'll change the color of this to white. So now we're ready to go. On this artboard, now I'm going to click on the artboard, and you could also click on any components in Principle. But this lightning bolt here gives me access to any of the event transitions for interactions. So you could do a tap transition or a scroll begin or whatever you want. But in this case, I'm just going to have it auto transition around. So I'm going to drag this spaghetti code. And that's the other nice thing about Principle, is it just uses spaghetti code. So this is just a shortcut to duplicate the artboard, but I could also manually Command D, duplicate it, and then drag it. So I'll just show that to you guys too, so you can see it. So I can actually take this artboard, duplicate it, and then from here also do the spaghetti code transition there. So that was just a shortcut when you drag it to itself. Then I'm going to take this loading animation right here, and I'm just going to flip the angle of it to 180 degrees. So now in our previewer here, if I start on this first artboard, you see how it swoops around to the side. So inside of this arrow auto transition, you have access to control the timing of the interaction as well as the curves. So it felt a little fast, so I'm just going to increase this to like 0.65. And then since this example is about easing, I'm going to change the easing controls. I'm just going to customize this a little bit so it's like a little smoother of a curve. But now you see how there's like a nice, it's a little like longer of a curve and a little smoother. So then what I'm going to do is, to make it go all the way around to the top, I'm going to duplicate this artboard again with an auto transition, but this time I'm going to change the loading animation to an angle of 360. So now it's going to flip all the way around. So I'm just going to show you this. And you can see it got weird again, and that's because when I duplicated it, it duplicated the ease in transition, and we actually want an ease out transition on the last part. So I'm just going to extend this curve here, and now you'll see that it has a nice loop around. But we want it to continue. We don't want it to just do it once. So I'm going to auto transition this back to the first one, and you'll see something funny happen here. So it's going back the other way, and that's because it's going from 0 degrees to 180 degrees to 360, and then back to 0 immediately. So it has to flip around. So one sort of hack to change this is, inside of this, I can decrease the time for it to go from 360 degrees to 0 degrees, because it's still the same place, and just set it to 0. So now it's going to smoothly just keep looping around forever. And one other thing about Principle is, for auto transitions, you have to hover over the preview box. So as soon as I take this out, it's going to pause wherever it was. So when I started using Principal, I didn't realize this, and I'd be like, why did it stop? Like, I don't understand why the auto is not continuing. So that, just so you know. OK, I'm going to keep moving so we can get through the next two examples. But I'm going to close that out here. And let's continue. OK, so I'm going to turn these guys off. So this is another probably pretty familiar concept, Parallax Scroll, in case you guys missed that huge thing where it was on every website for the past, like 5 years ago. Basically, what Parallax does is it takes multiple elements and lets them move at different speeds. So this can be used to show elevations and emphasize different depths. And I think this is going to be an example that all of you guys are familiar with, just the Google Calendar app. This is just the black theme that my husband's really proud of. So he was like, you have to include it. But this is pretty simple. So basically, the calendar app and the December text is moving at the same speed, and that picture behind it of the skier and the snow is just moving at a different speed than the rest of the app. So let's jump in and do the live demo of this one. So in this case, I'm going to open Sketch, actually. So this is this one, because I want to show you guys what my sketch file looks like and show you also how to import from Principal. So it's pretty basic. All I've done here is I've pulled the status and navbar together, and the floating action button here, and this navbar at the bottom. So these three are going to stay static even while I'm scrolling. So I just pulled those up, and then in here we have the illustration of December, and then we also have the rest of the scroll view calendar, and then just this December text. So I'm going to open Principal again. And so you can also see how similar they look. This is what I'm talking about. Like, it's kind of hard to even tell which one's which. So now that I'm in Principal, I'm just going to tap Import here. And Principal's smart enough to know to pull whichever sketch file you have up first in your file. So in this case, it knows to pull this Google Calendar one. So I'm just going to import that. And you see here that it imports exactly the same way that my sketch file was set up. So even when I open this, I see the December illustration and these two right here. So let me expand this so you can see what I'm doing. And the first thing we want to do is resize the artboard, because our nav bar is down here, and there's still like the screen overlapping over it. So that's really standard and straightforward. I'm just going to drag the artboard up to here. So now you see that. The weird thing, though, is like I can't scroll here. And the reason for that is you actually have to define that in Principal. So if I tap on this calendar background folder, I actually have the option to change this from static to scroll. And I'm only going to change the vertical one because I want the scroll to be up and down and not left and right. So now you can see I can pull it a little bit, but it doesn't really let me pull it all the way. And that's because this blue line here representing the scroll view needs to be pulled up to that same size. So as soon as I pull this blue line up, now I'll be able to fully scroll in the view. So now we have the basic setup done. And we're going to use a little more complicated, it's not super complicated, but a really powerful feature in Principal, and that's drivers. So drivers in Principal allow you to create interactions within the same artboard that are dependent on other things. So it's not just like a tap transition to another one. So you can see when I open the drivers, it defaulted to the scroll Y, so the vertical movement of this calendar background, which is exactly what we want. So what I want it to do is I want this December calendar illustration right here to move also in the Y. So here I have access to all of these different properties. So I'm going to select the Y property of the December illustration. And then on the scroll Y of the calendar background, I want this Y to change. So you can see it created a keyframe here for me. And when I scroll along here, And we got some news too. So when I scroll this up to the top here, I'm just gonna add, I can manually add a keyframe here, or I can shift this up and it will automatically add it for me because it knows that I moved the Y position of it. So now you can see how this changes at a different speed. So I can play with it up here in the drivers or over here. And just to show you guys another example of that, I'll also change the opacity. So I can pick another property here of the December illustration, like opacity, and then it's at 100% here. And on the scroll, I want it to change to, for example, like 20%. So now on the scroll, it's also going to change the opacity. So you can see that it's getting lighter up there. So it's a really, really powerful tool in principle. But so that's Parallax. Super easy. Like I can make it in like 5 seconds. So that's Parallax. And let me just exit this, and we'll move on to the last one. So this is another really cool thing about the material guidelines. They have a lot of information about gestures. So they encourage using like carets and other indicators that show the user what they can expect. You know, like, oh, can I scroll? Can I pull? So this I thought was a really cool example because it's showing me that I'm doing something right in pinching. Like I'm seeing the pictures get bigger and I'm seeing the layout change as I do it. It's not just like an instant change. There's fluidity to it. So I think one really good example of this is actually the Capital One app. So this is the transfer money screen in the Android mobile app. And you can see to confirm that I want to transfer money after I filled out all this information, as soon as I drag the floating action button, the opacity of this drag to transfer changes, and the target circle gets bigger as you get closer as well. And then as soon as you drop it in, the target circle over there, it shrinks down and the other one fades away, and then we see that loading spinner again. So I'm gonna jump in and do this one, and this one also uses drivers in principle. So it'll be cool for you guys to see that. So I'm just gonna open my sketch file here. And this sketch file I set up in a very similar way to the previous one. So here in this drag to transfer folder, I have all of the components that we're gonna need to update. So there's a blue money floating action button, a placeholder circle beneath it, and I'll just toggle this off so you can see it. That's what it looks like. Then there's this drag to transfer text with an arrow, and then there's the target circle. And then I just threw everything else like inside of the transfer info, like all this stuff in here in the screen background, because we don't really need to touch that. So I'm gonna open Principle again. And this time, I'll remember to turn this on. So I'm gonna import our sketch file, and like you see here, now it's pulling the Capital One, not the Google Parallax one. So I'm gonna import this. And the first thing I'm gonna do is select this blue floating action button right here. So now instead of using scroll, we're gonna play with the drag properties. So I'm gonna change the horizontal to drag, and now you'll see that I can drag it, but even when I pull it up or down, it only moves across this axis. And that's why we also want to change the vertical one to drag. And now I can drag it wherever I want. So now that we're set with that, we're going to use our drivers again. And you'll see here now it's pulling both the X of the blue money fab, but also the Y of the blue money fab. So what we want to do is actually adjust the drivers on the X-axis. So I'm going to click on the drag to transfer text, and we want to adjust the opacity of this one as you're dragging on the X-axis. So I'm just going to select under the X one, the opacity right here. So it's at 100% opacity right here. And as you drag, once I get to about halfway right here, I want the opacity to go to 0%. So now you can see what this looks like here, like this. So that looks good. And then the other thing we want to change is the size of this target circle. So I'm going to select the target circle right here. And let's see here. So in here, I'm going to select the scale. So it starts at a scale of 1, and then as I drag and get closer, so that's like about right here, I want the scale to increase probably like 1.5. So now you can see what this looks like here. So that looks good. And I can play with it in my previewer here. So you can see it's the same way. As soon as I move over to the left side, the opacity of the drag to transfer is gonna increase again, and the scale will increase as I get closer. So that looks good. But now we need to set the release property of the drag. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna select this blue money fab, and inside of this lightning bolt here, you see a drag end transition. So I'm gonna drag that to this just to duplicate it. And what I wanna do is, in this new artboard, I'm gonna take this blue money fab, and we want it to be here. And I can close the drivers too, because we've already got this now. And I'm gonna set the scale of this target circle to 1. And then the last thing I'm gonna do is set this placeholder text circle to 0%. So now I still have this ability, and then as soon as I drop it in here, you saw that all shrunk around. So how am I doing on time, Dan? Do I have time to, yeah? Okay, cool. So I'm gonna add now that loading animation that we created at the beginning. We're gonna add it here so you guys can see like a full end-to-end interaction. So from here, we're gonna do the same process that I did in the beginning. So I'm gonna create a green animation in this case, and I'm gonna set the radius to really high so that it's circular. And then I'm gonna set, we're gonna create our clipping mask again so that it's around. Oops. And this guy. So I want this to be a 68 by 68. Good, we'll constrain those proportions, and I'm gonna bump the radius up. And then just make sure that this guy is centered there. So then I'm gonna do the same thing where I'm gonna take these two layers and group them. And I'm just gonna rename this loading animation. And then we're gonna do the clip sublayers again. So this is creating our mask. So now I've got this guy, and I'm gonna change the radius here to a lot so that it's there. And now we're gonna need to make sure that the green guy is on top. And now in this case, since we already have our sublayer set to this, we don't even need this gray circle, so I can actually delete that, and it'll maintain that for me. So then this artboard, I'm gonna do the same thing that we did initially, but on a larger artboard, and just create an auto transition here. And I'm gonna set this loading animation to 180 degrees. And then in here, I'm gonna do the same thing. So here you see all the things that have changed across the principal file, but in this case, I only want the angle of the loading animation. So I'm gonna expand this to 0.65 seconds and also add our ease constraints again. And I'll just customize this a little bit. So now we'll see that guy again. And then we'll make another auto transition here. And set this to 360. And then, as we remember from before, we have to change this to ease out. So now we have that. That looks good. And then one thing I want to do is expand the tail of it. So inside of our loading animation, I can change the scale here. And we can make it really extreme. That might be a little too extreme, but let's do 2. So now it's gonna do that. Did you see how when we got from this beginning, how it expanded first and then went around? So that's because the scale now doesn't match, the scale of our layer doesn't match the loading animation timing. So I'm going to expand this to match it so that, and also match the curve so that it will change at the same time as the speed of our loop. So I'm going to do this. And then we're just going to have to do the same thing on this second transition as it goes from the 180 to the 360. So I'm going to expand this out, 0.65, and set this to ease out. So that looks good. And then the last thing we're going to do is just make an auto transition from this last screen to back to this one. And then remember, we're going to see that weird thing again where it loops around. So all I have to do is move the angle transition down to 0 seconds. And now it should loop forever. So I'll just show you guys the whole interaction again. So we have, as I'm dragging, the opacity of the drag to transfer text changes, and the target circle gets bigger as I get closer. And then as soon as I release it, that initiates the infinite loading animation. So that's that demo. And let's see here. OK. So yeah, that's from the Capital One app. And those were the 3 demos. I guess I made it through even faster than I expected. So thanks for watching, guys. If you want to learn more about Principal, I know this was like a little bit advanced, like we went over masks, drivers, stuff like that. It's a little more complicated. But actually, I created an introduction class on Skillshare, and it goes through the basics of like tap transitions and how to like set up your artboard and more about like the actual layout of Principal. And I also regularly post more complicated Principal tutorials like these on my YouTube channel if you want to check it out. My contact info is right here if you want to reach out. I actually don't really use Twitter. I only put it on there because I felt like it balanced the slide out better. So probably don't hit me up on Twitter, but you can send me an email. Yeah, I'm a designer. So, so yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Questions? What? Oh, I do have a dribble. Oh, I should have put my dribble. Yeah, it's I think it's Amanda Legge, so easy to find.
Great presentation, thank you. What's the workflow after this for the development?
Yeah.
And maybe
So
that's too big of a question.
No, it's totally a good question. So I'll just show you a couple things here. So in Principal, there's a couple ways that you can export. So too bad I just closed all 3 of those files. But OK, let's say we've created something. Then you can record it right here. So you actually have multiple recording options in case you're doing like web, you have an arrow cursor, or if you have an automatic one like a loading spinner and you don't want a cursor, or a touch cursor for mobile. So basically you can record here, and this little guy is ready, and then whatever interactions I have, I can do them. And then there's a shortcut, Control V, to start and stop the recording. And I can export it as both a movie and a GIF file. So, and this is how I do my dribble for you. This is how I export my Principal stuff in Dribble. So I can export those, but the problem with that is it's only a visual for the developers, right? It's not anything.
There's an animated SVG tool that's very, very similar to how you did all of your animation. It's no black and timing.
Oh yeah?
I mean, if you can export this in SVG, you could probably just go through manually without too much trouble, just copy those animations.
Yeah. That's a great idea.
I forget what the name is. I think it might be listed if you look at there's a whole list of those tools for kind of sports and stuff. I think it's this one. I think it's something like Roman there.
But to answer your question, when I hand it off to developers, usually it's I just tell them like, hey, so because when you look in the animation and driver constraints, like I can say, look, it's a 0.65 second transition between this, and this is the curve, because like you saw in, let me just, so we'll say like a tap transition here to another screen, and I'll expand this guy here. So now from this screen, when I do that, like I can say like, okay, look, it takes this many, like 0.3 seconds, and this is the curve, and you can kind of like customize it. But right now it's pretty manual.
And so what I'm thinking about this this is your design of record, how do we automate a UI test that pulls your values here and validates that?
Does it support plugins at all?
That's a good question. And I don't know the answer to that, but since it plays so nicely with Sketch, I imagine that it wouldn't be that difficult to create them. Because Sketch, it's very easy to create plugins for Sketch.
Yep. Is there a way to, like, so like you might have 4 screens and each one
Mhm.
different, like end state or whatever.
Yep.
If you like change text on one, can you make a change on the other, like using a symbol like in Sketch, or do you
So-
have to copy paste?
There's no symbols in Principle, but the one nice thing about the animation is if it's named the same thing across the artboard, Principle automatically animates it for you.
Okay.
So like, as far as naming structure goes, especially when you're importing from sketch files, as long as you're careful about naming it, when I duplicate it and then whatever change I make, like this, because this is called layer and layer, it's gonna work. But if I change this one to be like layer 2, now, did you see how it jumped? Like it didn't transition it for me, it's just like moving it. So I know that doesn't exactly answer your question about text.
If you change the color blue on the left, the right one would stay gray, I assume.
Actually, so that if I change this back to being the same name, like layer, I can change colors too. You can change pretty much any value you want. So it automatically changes it for you.
They are distinct. Yeah, they're not mapping back.
So yeah, if I change the name of this one to layer, like just let's say 2, now all it's doing is transitioning to a new artboard. It's like not even, in Principle, these are not the same element. It's just like, also I'll move it up here so it's easier to understand, but like now it's not doing anything. It's just transitioning to the new artboard. But when this is called the same thing, you'll see here that it transitions to it. So it actually animates it itself.
Cool.
Can you go back to Sketch and modify something, and will those values show back up?
You have to re-import it, but yes. And it actually works really well. So
So you won't lose your animations?
no.
As long as things are named.
Exactly, as long as they're named the same thing. And that is another, like, one time that happened to me and I was just like, all right, I'm just gonna start over because this is not worth my time to try and diagnose this problem. Yeah, so naming is, you have to be really, really conscious and careful about naming conventions. Any other questions? Cool, thanks for watching.